Welcome to this micro course titled ASP.NET MVC Core Absolute Basics, where the title says it all. We're going to be focusing on just the basics to help build a conceptual skeleton that you can then flesh out later on. This course is intentionally short. Don't worry. Subsequent micro courses on ASP.NET MVC Core will focus on specific areas of the framework to help us get solid in those areas. I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. But before we dive into ASP.NET MVC Core with some examples and so on, let me take a few minutes in this video to answer some of the most basic questions, like why does ASP.NET MVC Core even exist? I mean, now there's several different frameworks we can choose from to build web applications. And then why should I learn ASP.NET MVC Core? What will this do for me? So, as I said a moment ago, my intent here is to cover the absolute basics. If you're already familiar with ASP.NET MVC 5 on the previous .NET framework, then you can honestly skip this particular micro course and move on to one of the other micro courses that'll become available. Start learning some of the new features or features that have changed fundamentally from what you might already be familiar with. So ASP.NET MVC course is a framework. So I want to start by talking about frameworks in general. Frameworks are a collection of application programming interfaces, or APIs, along with tooling and other utilities that make developing a particular type of application easier. So furthermore, application frameworks provide both a strategic and a tactical approach to developing a particular type of application. If you buy into the philosophy, if you follow their approach, if you follow their suggested structure, then you'll be productive more quickly. Frameworks also provide abstractions away from the details of working with lower level types of things, whether it be messages or other software systems or whatever the case might be. So for example, instead of working directly with an HTTP message that comes in as a request to the web server, where you have to parse out the verbs from that message, you have to parse out the query string data, the form data, any cookie data that was sent along in that message. Instead, APIs are usually available inside of a framework that allow you to access those pieces of information in a programmatically friendly object. All right. So the .NET Core itself is a framework, and it's part of a family of frameworks for developing applications. ASP.NET MVC Core is a framework that's part of a family specifically used for developing web applications. It has a dependency on the .NET framework or .NET Core framework. Same thing with the Entity Framework Core. It's another part of that same family, but its job is to help you access databases and abstract away all of the details of connecting and retrieving data and so on. So it also has this dependency on this larger .NET Framework Core or .NET Core. So frameworks are meant to make things easier. It usually takes some time to learn the framework. It takes time to learn the approach, learn the philosophy in order to get anything real or productive out of it, but once you spend that time, then you can generally be more productive. Some frameworks have the philosophy that drive their design that web development is fundamentally hard, so the creators of that framework try to abstract as many details away and hide as many of the complexities from the developers as possible. Other frameworks take a different approach and a philosophy that large web projects can get messy. So we should try to help developers who are working on larger projects, more complex projects, to utilize a design pattern aimed at structuring and organizing lots of code so that it's more easily developed and maintained over time. And so those are the two basic philosophies in the two fundamentally different frameworks available from Microsoft for building web applications. And you know, if we back away from Microsoft, there are many different web development frameworks out there available, and there are at least two from Microsoft. If you followed along with my C# via ASP.NET course, we use the ASP.NET Web Forms framework extensively. It's the oldest .NET framework for web development dating all the way back to 2002 when it was officially released. A little bit earlier than that, you could build on the beta bits. But that's what, as I'm recording this 15 years ago, that's a lifetime in terms of the internet and web development. And there was back then in 2000, 2001, 2002, there were a fleet of Visual Basic programmers who were trying to transition their skill sets from building these exclusively desktop Battleship Gray based forms applications, and Microsoft wanted to give those people a way to leverage that skill set to build web applications, and so that's why you have ASP.NET Web Forms. So a lot of the decisions, the original decisions around ASP.NET Web Forms was driven from that fundamental philosophy that web development is hard. If we give people a progression, a learning progression from what they already know, we can make it easier for them to transition. However, those design decisions had consequences and some limitations. So, for example, once projects got beyond, a simple dozen, 2 dozen forms, then larger projects started to become unwieldy with files and folders strewn everywhere within the project. It became more difficult to manage the complexity. Furthermore, as far as the framework itself was concerned, web forms enforced a tight coupling between an actual URL and a file on the file system that represented a web page. And so as the web evolved, something known as RESTful URLs, which we're not going to take much time to talk about, but you could approach the URL of your website as a type of user interface. So friendlier URLs became in vogue, and it became difficult to take these old URLs that were built based on a file structure and transition them over to a more friendly, expressive style of URL. Furthermore, with regards to web forms, new programming disciplines began to emerge to help approach the software development process in a more engineering mindset fashion. So there were things like unit testing that began to emerge and become popular, and so that required, in order for you to do unit testing, you had to be able to isolate individual units to test them. Units typically were methods inside of applications, so each of those units or methods could be tested individually. However, the philosophy behind web forms was to simplify stuff, which sometimes meant combining things together or tying them together, making the process kind of invisible to the user, but tightly couples the presentation of a particular data point to a method, and there was no way to separate the two so that you could just test that method, right? It just made it more difficult to unit test. And these are just a few of the examples of some of the downsides of web forms. There's a lot of web forms code still running in the world today, and probably will for decades to come. So your knowledge of web forms framework is not wasted. There will be plenty of opportunities to dust it off and use it out in the real world. Now, in 2006, a new framework became available called Ruby on Rails. It took a lighter weight tact. They weren't concerned so much with helping Visual Basic programmers transition into the web development world. First of all, Ruby on Rails was it could run on inexpensive Linux servers, which caught the eye of many startups as they were trying to build their web-based business. It also followed a design pattern called MVC, or Model View Controller, and that design pattern, which we'll talk about extensively in the next video, it sought to separate the major concerns of an application, of a web application. And so this could help to untangle some of the unwieldiness of the style that was chosen by web forms, which is one file for one URL. And so once you separate out concerns, how we present a model and where do we put the kind of the business logic, once you separate those concerns out into different files or different units, it became possible for you then to test those units, test those methods more easily. And then Ruby on Rails also had a opinionated approach to web development. It adopted a phrase, convention over configuration. So in other words, if you followed their naming conventions, if you followed their folder structure, and so on, you could be successful very quickly. Now, if you needed to change everything, then you might want to look elsewhere. This is not the web framework for you. We're not going to apologize. We're not going to make it all things to all people. So again, a very opinionated way of approaching web development, where as Microsoft was trying to accommodate a lot of different developers and scenarios, Ruby on Rails said, forget all that. If you want to do this job, we can do it fast, and we can give you the tools to make it happen really quickly. Ruby on Rails also favored a command line based set of tools, of tooling that you could use to type just a few commands on a command line prompt and design the shape of your data model. Type a few more commands on that same command line, and you could generate the code that's required to perform basic CRUD operations on that data model, and then type a few more commands on the command line and be able to save that model into a database. So it was minimalistic but very powerful once you learned the syntax and all the switches and so on of those command line tools. Admittedly, it made the learning curve a little bit sharp because the commands were cryptic and you had to type them all out. There's no visual interface, but once you got familiar with it, then you can move very quickly. So for many years, Microsoft considered developers a key strategic asset within their organization. If we can keep the developers writing software on our platform, companies will be forced then to continue to use our platform to host and to drive their businesses. So keeping developers in the fold, so to speak, became one of Microsoft's priorities. This led to a rethinking of ASP.NET Web Forms as the popularity of Ruby on Rails grew. I had some friends personally that jumped ship, got out of the Microsoft camp, and moved on to Ruby on Rails. So there was definitely some erosion of that developer base going on in about that 2006, 2007, 2008 timeframe. And so this led to an effort within Microsoft by a few developers to maybe take a fresh look at ASP.NET. They took key aspects of the ASP.NET framework and lopped off all of the pieces that could be replaced by a new framework. And so the web forms part was abstracted away, and what you really had were a core set of components that could interact with a web server, handle requests, and so on. And then on top of that, they built a new framework that had a more Ruby on Rails style approach. So since about 2008, Microsoft has now had two primary website development frameworks that were both built on ASP.NET and .NET framework. And so you have Web Forms and ASP.NET MVC. Now, about that same time, a few things were converging all at the same time. The cloud became in vogue, and everybody's trying to figure out what the cloud is. And large companies were trying to build their own cloud infrastructure. And the thought process was that we can offer services based on our clouds to customers, and those clouds can host a plethora of different applications or back ends for applications. So the cloud began what we now call IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service, where you could simply host virtual machines that contain Windows or Linux operating system on a mesh of computers that were hosted at remote locations. So this saved companies the hassle of acquiring and provisioning new servers. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you are actually working in an IT shop, working with a vendor, ordering the components, getting them configured correctly, waiting for those servers to come in, installing them into your rack system, usually the basement of your building where that was air conditioned and had special monitoring software and all that, and then getting administrators to install the proper software and patches, and then finally you could host your applications. That process could take weeks. So fast forward now, you get an image of a hosting environment running Windows or Linux, and it's already pre-configured, and now I just need another instance of that. I don't have to call anybody. I can go on a website and say, I need 5 new instances of that to handle the demand for all the new customers that we have coming in. And within minutes, we could have that set up and have multiple instances of that virtual machine with our application already installed. And we could just pay for those virtual machines as they've been instantiated, and then after the seasonal rush is over, perhaps we could get rid of those instances and only pay for that hardware that we're actually using when we're using it. So IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service, gave birth to a more granular approach known as PaaS, or Platform as a Service, where entire software services were abstracted away and offered individually. So if you needed web hosting, you could just pay for the web hosting part. You don't have to actually have a virtual machine configured running your software. Microsoft already has pre-configured virtual machines that they will rent you on a minute-by-minute basis. So you could have that up and running literally in minutes, published from Visual Studio, and you could even scale that up or have it automatically scale up based on demand, based on certain allowances for how much traffic you're receiving and how much how much your traffic has reduced. You can actually remove those instances automatically, but you're only paying for the web hosting part of it. If you need a database, that's cool. We can spin you up a database very quickly. You're only paying for the amount of data transfer that you're actually using in and out of SQL Server. So now there are dozens of these little platform as a service offerings for Microsoft, and other companies like Amazon and Google do the same sorts of things. And so this shift in how applications were hosted meant that Microsoft could serve more customers with less physical hardware. However, there was a catch. Microsoft, their primary web platform technology was based on a 15-year-old framework, the ASP.NET Web Forms. And ASP.NET Web Forms had grown and grown to the point where it became quite capable of everything that was possible in web development, but it came at a price. The way ASP.NET was built, all the code related to ASP.NET was stored in just a few physical files on the file system. You often hear the term system.web. That was the namespace, and it represented a file that contained a lot of the code that could do almost anything web related. And so when a request came to a web server, that web server, Internet Information Services, would need to load up that system.web DLL that contained all of that code into memory and create objects from that code file. And the result was that the framework required a lot of hardware to do just very simple things. And so if Microsoft could re-architect that framework in such a way that that dependencies were more granular, and so you only loaded in the parts that you actually needed, and you don't get all of this huge framework to come along into memory for the ride, then that meant that Microsoft could dramatically reduce the number of resources required to host your web application, which meant that they could spend less money on servers, which meant that you as the customer could spend less money, which means and they could split the difference and keep more money for themselves. So a rewrite of ASP.NET would mean that Microsoft could rethink how several aspects of the framework were architected, not just how dependencies were actually divvied up into different files, but then maybe other things too that could be improvements over the previous architecture. So perhaps maybe offering a more flexible configuration system than what was available before. Maybe a more extensible request pipeline where I could plug in at more points during the process of the web request coming to my code and then being responded out back to the user. Maybe they could re-architect the system that would inject common dependencies into software components that are necessary, like I need a database connection. Do you have to create a new database connection every single time you need one, or can you just say, hey, I need a database connection and have it delivered to you? And this would help improve by having all of those dependencies injected in. We could mock those dependencies and do better unit testing, which is what some of the enterprise customers were asking for, and has become kind of a common design aspect for software development nowadays. So we could also, heck, make it cross-platform in the process, and then also just why don't we just develop it out and open so we can get input from customers in real time as we're checking in code, and even allow contributions from the community. So there are all these things that they could do, and they were very excited about this effort. So that's essentially the backstory of ASP.NET MVC Core. It's a remarkable framework. It's the first framework of its kind to be built from the ground up with an eye to being hosted in the cloud. It improves on many of the things that we loved about the previous ASP.NET frameworks, and it's much more performant. You can see that they're constantly working on improving the number of pages that can be served per second, and I think they've got it up to at least 500,000 pages per second that can be served up from the framework itself. So me personally, I took the last 6 months before recording this course, and I stopped recording videos, and I worked on a large project that used ASP.NET MVC Core, and I think I touched probably just about every aspect of what ASP.NET MVC Core has to offer. And I did so in a very practical scenario, something that I hope to maybe one day turn into a business, not a bunch of hello world projects that really don't stress the framework and help you to fundamentally understand what's going on in the framework. So I felt that was really necessary in order for me to get my head around ASP.NET MVC Core and gain the confidence that I needed to record courses like these. So one of the challenging aspects of working with ASP.NET MVC Core was that it was in active development as I was trying to work with it. Even as I record this, I'm using version 1.1.2, but version 2.0 is around the corner. I think it's going to be released here in the next couple of months. And I already can see that there are some significant changes coming, none of which will really impact what we have to say here in this course, but there are going to be some things that have been smoothed out in a 2.0 version that were overlooked in the first version. So at first, as I was developing this big project, many third-party libraries that I wanted to use, open source libraries, basic ones like even JSON.NET and others, as well as some of the tooling that was available in the preview versions of Visual Studio, they simply weren't ready to be used in ASP.NET MVC Core projects. Many times there were no answers for the kind of issues that I ran into, especially whenever I hit an issue where something worked locally on my computer, but when I pushed it out to the cloud, it would no longer work. So, in my time as a software developer, I've come to realize that working with APIs that are under active development means a few things. First of all, you've got to be patient because there are fewer books and videos and articles out on the web that even discuss that particular technology. So you've got to be willing to kind of experiment and figure out things for yourself. And secondly, you have to understand that features are in flux, and sometimes you have to go and actually look at the discussion in the community that's going on and understand what the issues are, what the possible solutions are, and how that might impact your project, and then make your voice heard and actually try to be part of the solution. And that's just the nature of software development in general, especially if you'll be working with newer technologies. And that's why, as the old expression goes, developers make the big bucks. Now, if you're already familiar with ASP.NET MVC 5, I said this earlier, I want to say it again, this micro course is probably not a very good use of your time because we're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details of ASP.NET MVC Core per se. You might be better served just moving on beyond this intro course because we're going to talk about things that you probably already knew from your work with version 5 on the full .NET framework. I felt like I needed to create this course to help those who are just getting started come up to speed with the basic fundamental principles of what is ASP.NET MVC, what are the major components, how do they interact together, what are the responsibilities, and so on. And then once they get up to speed, they can kind of follow along with the actual micro courses that are devoted to specific parts of the framework to get more done. Okay. In this micro course, I'm just going to cover, again, the absolute basics. That's the title of this course. All I really want to do is give you a firm foundation to build on. My main goal is to gain a basic, fundamental, conceptual understanding of each of the major parts of the framework and show how they relate to each other. And once you have that mental model, then we'll be able to go beyond that and build more interesting examples and learn more about the framework. Once you have this framework in place, you'll be able to dive deeper into each of the components and master those and learn specific techniques that I have learned myself over the past 6 months. I'm going to show you what I've done. I'm going to present each of these in micro courses, super focused, tiny courses. You can stitch these courses together however you want to. Whenever you feel like you need to learn about one specific part, you can just go to that micro course, and it doesn't have a dependency on the rest of the courses in this collection of ASP.NET MVC courses that we'll create. But by the time I'm done, I hope to cover just about everything available in ASP.NET MVC Core. Keeping each course tiny will help you and me both. It'll help me get it finished, and it will help you to avoid that which you don't need, skip over the parts you don't need to know. At some point, I'm going to try to create a map of how all the micro courses interrelate once I get deeper into this effort. Also, I'm not going to be presenting this material in a very clinical way. It's going to be mostly off the cuff based on my own personal experience. If you're looking for precision and breadth, then you probably want to just skip videos altogether and go directly to the documentation. So my job is to help you learn how to harness the framework as quickly as possible based on my own experiences, which means I'll probably gloss over things which I don't think are all that important. So, okay, enough yakking. Let's go ahead and get to work in the next video and talk about the MVC design pattern. What are design patterns, and what are the major responsibilities of model and view and controller? See you then. Thanks.